Hello and welcome. This is video number 2 in a 6-part series about the post-World War I world. And in this video, the focus is going to be on some of the changes that were taking place in society in the years following World War I. Here we go. Now, there's a lot of different things that we could focus on in talking about just changes that occurred in societies around the world in the years after World War I. But what I want to focus on for the purposes of this video is just to highlight a few major changes that came about as a result of World War I that probably, on the balance, we would put into the positive side. Some things are very obviously changes that we would put into the positive category. Others maybe not quite as obvious, but overall positive changes that were coming about. If you watched the previous video, we talked a little bit about some of the challenges and the uncertainty of the time. And just want to make sure you know that even though there might have been some concerns in some aspects of the post-World War I years that were quite bleak, there were also some really good things that came from it as well. And that's what this video is going to look at. Now, the first thing that we'll talk about here, if you look at the slide, it's called an opening society. And those are ladies in the picture up there. One of the big areas for change, going back to actually during the wartime, but then definitely beyond, was the role of women in society and just what their opportunities really were and how they were starting to really change. So if you go back to the war years, one of the things that came about was out of a need for people to work in factories and produce in America, for example. Basically needed everybody who was available to work, and that included women. So women ended up being thrust into doing things that were really pretty out of the ordinary for women at that time. And then when the war was done, and there wasn't necessarily the same need that there had been during the war for women to do some of those roles, it was really difficult to expect women to just go back to how things were as if nothing had happened, because there were certainly some perceptions before the war that there were only certain things that women were able to do or capable of doing or should be doing. During the war, women had a great opportunity to prove that there were all kinds of things that they were capable of doing, and so kind of like ringing a bell, it was hard to unring that bell for those who wanted to say, "Oh yeah, women have certain things that they can do, and that's it," because women really proved that they were capable of all kinds of things. And so one of the things we see moving forward, getting into the 1920s and this post-World War I time, were changes for what women were doing just throughout society. Some minor changes, like wearing their hair differently, wearing their hair shorter. But then there were bigger changes, like seeing more women pursue careers and try to get into fields that previously were dominated by men, such as medicine, education, journalism, you name it. Also, this was a great opportunity for something that had been going on for quite some time up to this point, which was the push for women to have greater equality in society, and especially in terms of things like voting opportunities. If you focus on the United States, women had been working for decades up to this point to have full equality when it came to voting. There were some parts of the country and in some types of elections that women had equality with men, but many places they didn't. And the passage of the 19th Amendment took place and was ratified on into 1920, guaranteeing women the opportunity to vote the same as men around the country. So that was a great step for women. And moving away just from women specifically, just generally, what was viewed as okay in society for whether it was women or younger people or whatever it might be, was definitely changing. And one of the big things that was facilitating a lot of that change was some of the new technologies that were becoming available, some of which really began to develop during the wartime. So the ability for people to get from one place to another was starting to really change. The ability to communicate with people that weren't right next to you was beginning to change. So there were a lot of opportunities for things to be different. And I think especially as it relates to women, this was it was terrible to have to be in the war. But one of the positive externalities that came from that is women had an opportunity to really show what they were made of and what they were capable of. And once that happened, there was really no way to go back to how things were before. And so it was a big step forward for women, having all kinds of new opportunities that they hadn't necessarily had before. Now, something that is often very true during wartime is that technologies move forward much faster than they might otherwise. When you're fighting in a war, there is an incentive to try to be able to outdo the other side. And so lots of creative things are done to try to do just that. And then one of the things that turns out to be a positive externality of those wartime technological pushes is, though they might have been working on something with a wartime purpose, a lot of times there are innovations that take place that end up having a really positive impact in just the regular everyday life after that wartime period is over. And so, for example, during the war, there were a lot of improvements to automobiles that occurred in the interest of having better transportation and better transportation capabilities than the enemy. And when the war was over, that was able to translate to better quality automobiles at lower prices than ever before. And so one of the big things that changed after the war is the car became affordable for average people. And what that meant for a greater number of people is that more people could travel, more people could live farther away from where they worked. New businesses began to develop based on servicing the needs of vehicles and all of the different uses that were starting to come with the vehicle. And on top of that, just being able to have a vehicle represented a type of freedom that people had never really had before. Depending on the age for you who are watching this video, if you're in that kind of 15, 16, 17-year-old age, you're probably really beginning to experience the freedom that a car can bring, not necessarily having to rely on somebody to pick you up or take you someplace, but to actually be able to get someplace on your own. That's certainly a type of freedom. And when more people started to have cars going back to the 1920s, that was a real freedom opportunity as well. Airplane technology also advanced at this time. It's at this time that commercial airlines begin to emerge. And though air travel starting, going back to the 1920s and moving forward was extremely expensive at that time, it was on its way to becoming a normal mode of transportation. And of course, if you fast forward to today and think about today and think about taking away airline travel, I mean, our country, as we know it, would come to a standstill in many ways, whether it's business people needing to get from one place to another, whether it's products being able to get from one place to another, or just the opportunity and the freedom to be able to travel for pleasure from one place to another efficiently and safely. Air travel's definitely become I don't want to necessarily say a necessity, but definitely a fully integrated part of what it's like to live on planet Earth now. And a lot of that got a real jump start in the post-World War I years. And then one last thing I want to speak to about changes to society and different opportunities that people had. Wireless communication. That was a high priority during the war. The ability to communicate during that war over a distance, especially a relatively long distance, without having a physical connection, was huge. And so a lot of energy was put in to developing wireless technology to be able to communicate much more effectively than the enemy. And after the war, all those efforts to develop wireless communication for the war effort would really pay off big time in the beginning, especially by making commercial radio possible. And so getting into the 1920s, the radio became a really popular item for people who could afford it. And in fact, one thing that's kind of crazy is a really high percentage of people would end up by the end of the 1920s owning a radio, despite the fact that the cost at that time would be the equivalent today to spending several thousands of dollars on something. I suppose the comparable item for us today would be a television, because going back to the early radio days, what they used a radio for was very similar to what we would use a TV for today. I mean, they had entertainment type shows, news type shows, and of course, sporting events were broadcast over the radio. Now, what's kind of interesting is, as much as things have changed, the radio still exists, and the radio still has a lot of the same uses still today. I mean, people listen to the radio today for news. They listen to the radio today for sports. Maybe not quite as much on entertainment, but nevertheless, it was a very popular item then and very useful, and has continued to be useful to this day. So I think I'm going to leave it with that for our video today. But the one thing I did want to really point out with this video is that despite a lot of the destruction and devastation and uncertainty that came both with the war and immediately after, there were definitely some positive things that really evolved through the war effort and would prove to be helpful, enjoyable, beneficial things to society. So always good to look for the good in the things that happen. Hope you find this I found this video helpful and informative. Thanks for watching.